Welcome, everyone. I'm Cynthia Lazaroff, and on behalf of all of us at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, a very warm welcome to you all for our second program in the series, Nuclear Dangers in Ukraine. Our program will run today for about 90 minutes, and we will have time for Q&A following our speakers. We invite you to put your questions in the chat, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. As we move into the third month of the war in Ukraine, the risk of escalation to a catastrophic nuclear confrontation between Russia and the United States remains a clear and present danger, whether accidental or intentional. While the probability may be low, an unthinkable nuclear war is possible, and the fear of nuclear war is once again widespread. Nearly 70% of Americans surveyed by the American Psychological Association said they are worried the invasion of Ukraine is going to lead to nuclear war, and that they fear that we are at the beginning stages of World War III. Just how worried should we be about escalation to nuclear war? What are the risks? What are the stakes? And what can we as engaged and committed citizens do to make a difference? To shed light on these existential questions, we are deeply honored to have with us the two brilliant leading philosopher, public intellectual, expert, activist voices of our time, Noam Chomsky and Daniel Ellsberg. These two need no introduction, but for those who may not know, just a few words about each. Noam Chomsky is considered the founder of modern linguistics and is arguably the single most influential scholar in the world today. His work has influenced the fields of cognitive science, philosophy, psychology, computer science, mathematics, childhood education, anthropology, and more. He is Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at MIT and the author of more than 100 books. His most recent book is Requiem for the American Dream, The 10 Principles of Concentration of Wealth and Power. Still going strong at the age of 93, Professor Chomsky warned in a recent interview, "We're approaching the most dangerous point in human history. We are now facing the prospect of the destruction of organized human life on Earth." A very warm welcome to you, Noam. We're so honored to have you with us. Now to you, Dan. Daniel Ellsberg is known to many as the original whistleblower. In 1971, he released the Pentagon Papers, a top secret study of the US government's decision-making during the Vietnam War, which played a key role in bringing an end to the war. A recent Nation interview with Daniel opens with these words: "Arguably, no human on Earth has given more thought over the past 65 years to the possibilities of nuclear war, intentional or accidental." Daniel is the author of many books and articles, and his most recent book is The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. About the war in Ukraine, Daniel recently said, "As the world has correctly perceived, this has the seeds of a regional nuclear war and all-out war between the US and Russia." A very warm welcome to you too, Dan. And again, we're so honored to have you with us. Joining us today as my co-host is my fellow Nuclear Age Peace Foundation board member, Richard Falk, also a leading public intellectual and activist and professor emeritus at Princeton, where he inspired a generation of immensely fortunate students like me to embrace the vision of a world without nuclear weapons and become activists for nuclear disarmament. Noam, Dan, and Richard have all been courageous and dedicated activists for peace and justice for decades and have stood together for many causes since the Vietnam War. It's a rare privilege to have the three of you all together with us now for this urgent conversation at this dangerous moment for humanity. And with that, Richard, I welcome you now to offer your opening words.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's a great personal pleasure to be with such old and cherished friends as Noam and Dan. We've been together in many struggles over the decades, and I can think of no two people who have more to contribute to an understanding of this extraordinary crisis posed by not only the Russian aggression toward Ukraine, but the character of the US response to that aggression, which has, rather than calmed it, escalated it to these, to agitate the fears of nuclear weapons in a way that hasn't existed since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's a particular honor for me too to have the opportunity to listen to Noam and Dan, and to find the two individuals who I would think it's no exaggeration to say that for me at any rate, there are no other persons on the planet are more likely to provide an illuminating perspective on this at this critical hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And now, Noam, I'd like to invite you to share your insights and wisdom.
Okay, thank you. Winston Churchill has been quoted as saying that jaw is better than war. He may or may not have said it, but it doesn't matter. The sentiment is correct. And critically important, the fate of the human experiment on Earth may depend on it. If war continues to dominate practice, as it does, virtually 100%, we're on a path towards annihilation. Both before Russia's criminal invasion of Ukraine and since, there has been an immense flood of commentary about the crisis, almost entirely war. Virtually nothing about jaw, apart from the few experts in the area who've been shunted to the sidelines, if not bitterly condemned. They've been outlining feasible diplomatic solutions, which might well have prevented the aggression if anyone had paid attention to them. They may still exist, diminished, and they're still ignored. In fact, undermined in favor of escalating the war with all that may follow, including paths to species suicide that are not remote. Top US political and military officials tell us that the goal of the war is to weaken Russia, which must be given no escape hatch. It follows directly that we must engage in a hideous experiment, keep escalating the war in the hope that the crazed lunatic Putin will agree to slink away quietly in defeat, or perhaps will use the power that he surely has to devastate Ukraine and set the stage for terminal war. That's where we now are. Across the Atlantic, our partners in insanity are scarcely different. So Armed Forces Minister, British Armed Forces Minister James Heapy recommends that Ukraine attack military sites within Russia using the weapons that we provide. And he assures us that the mad dog Putin will not respond in any way that could lead on to major war. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss declare, I'm quoting, "We will keep going further and faster to push Russia out of the whole of Ukraine with no concessions to the irrational rogue operator who has to be taught a lesson." In short, the hideous experiment gambling with the lives of Ukrainians and the rest of us. The same is true of those doing their heroic impersonations about no-fly zones, meaning attacks on Russian anti-aircraft sites within Russia, again assuring us that the mad dog will observe in silence. Well, it doesn't really take much imagination to conjure up scenarios that might well lead to terminal war, but who cares? War is much more exciting. Well, to state the obvious, there are basically two ways for this war to end. One is a negotiated settlement. The other is one side destroys the other, perhaps in prolonged agony. Those who ignore or condemn the option of negotiated settlement are basically saying, let's carry out the grotesque experiment. That's operative policy, with a great deal of cheering across a wide range of opinion that holds that Russia delenda est, or at the liberal extreme, we must impose permanent isolation on Russia. Well, the call for permanent isolation means isolation from Europe and the English-speaking countries, maybe Japan and South Korea. The rest of the world condemns the brutal invasion, but is not going along. The sanctions map is very instructive in this regard. And one might in fact ask, who's going to be isolated as the world divides into a US-run region and the expanding Chinese commercial developmental system in Asia and well beyond, now joined by resource-rich but otherwise declining Russian kleptocracy? Well, I don't want to exaggerate. There are some figures in high places who are not willing to undertake the grotesque experiment. Even in England and the United States, the two warrior states that are at the heart of NATO. So in England, one such figure says, I'm quoting, "There must be an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine, followed by a Russian troop withdrawal, an agreement between Russia and Ukraine on future security arrangements. All wars end in a negotiation of some sort, so why not now? There's no reason to delay it for bombing and killing, more refugees, more dead, more grieving families in Ukraine and Russia." That's Jeremy Corbyn, who even went on to say that at some time in the future, we should maybe rethink NATO. After the Ukraine war ends, we should ask seriously whether military alliances bring peace, or do they actually encourage each other and build up to a greater danger? So what Corbyn is suggesting is that we might, after the war is over, consider the Gaullist vision of a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals with no military alliance, or the broader Gorbachev vision of what he called a European common home from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Again, no military alliances. Or even something like President George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, who suggested a program of partnership for peace, with NATO playing only a limited part in the background in a much broader alliance. That was a proposal that was killed by Bill Clinton when he violated Bush's firm and unambiguous commitment to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand beyond Germany. We should remember that that commitment was firm and unambiguous. There's been a lot of evasion and deceit about it. Well, for the crime of entertaining the ideas of de Gaulle, Gorbachev, and President Bush #1. For that crime, Corbyn received a stern reprimand from Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer, essentially expelling him from the party for this horrible suggestion. Well, that's Britain on the left. There are some similar voices in high places, even in the United States. So one such errant voice said, I'm quoting, "Doesn't make sense that Russia and Ukraine aren't sitting down and working out some kind of an agreement. If they don't do it soon, there will be nothing left but death, destruction, and carnage. This is a war that shouldn't have happened, but it did. The solution can never be as good as it would have been before the shooting started, but there is a solution, and it should be figured out now, not later, when everyone will be dead." That's Donald Trump, unwittingly echoing the analyses of prominent scholars who have been kept way at the margins. Of course, Trump was immediately castigated as a fool, if not a commsimp, to borrow one of the earlier terms that has been used to ensure obedience to the party line. After all, we must understand that we have to aid Ukraine, I'm quoting now, so that we can fight Russia over there, and we don't have to fight Russia here. That's the Democratic chair of the House Permanent Select Committee of Intelligence, Adam Schiff. So let's keep rigorously to war, not talk, as we pursue the grotesque experiment with the fate of Ukrainians and the world. Well, there are other rigorous principles that must be observed in our free society. We can learn a lot about ourselves, and a lot that bears on the hopes for saving Ukrainians and avoiding annihilation if we pay a little bit of attention to this. One principle that must be adhered to by right-thinking people is to refer to Putin's criminal aggression as his unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Out of curiosity, I did a Google search for this phrase, about 2.5 million results in a second. Out of curiosity, we might search for the phrase unprovoked invasion of Iraq. Try it. Gives about 11,000 results, all apparently from marginalized anti-war sources. Well, the example is instructive, not only in itself, but in its sharp reversal of the facts. The Iraq war was totally unprovoked. Cheney and Rumsfeld had to even resort to torture to try to find some particle of evidence to tie Saddam to Al-Qaeda. The famous disappearing weapons of mass destruction wouldn't have been a provocation for aggression, even if there'd been some reason to believe they existed. In contrast, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was most definitely provoked, although in today's hysterical climate, it's necessary to add the truism that provocation, which existed, provides no justification for the invasion. I'm sure you're all aware that a host of high-level US diplomats and policy analysts have been warning Washington for 30 years that it was reckless and needlessly provocative to ignore Russia's security concerns, particularly its two red lines: no NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine in Russia's geostrategic heartland. Well, in full understanding of what it's doing, since 2014, NATO, which means the United States, I'm quoting now, has provided significant support to Ukraine with equipment, with training. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have been trained. And then when we saw the intelligence indicating a possible invasion, allies stepped up last autumn and winter before the invasion. That's NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. President Zelensky was elected in 2019 with an overwhelming mandate for peace. He immediately moved to pursue it with great courage. He had to confront right-wing militias who threatened to kill him if he tried to reach a peaceful settlement along the lines of the Minsk II formula. If he had been backed by the United States, he could have persisted, perhaps solving the problem. US refused, preferred its policy of integrating Ukraine within NATO, dismissing Russia's wedlines. That commitment was stepped up further last September with an official US policy statement calling for sending more advanced weapons to Ukraine while continuing, I'm quoting now, continuing our robust training and exercise program in keeping with Ukraine's status as a NATO enhanced opportunities partner. That policy was given further formal status in a November 10th US-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership signed by Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Well, Americans were protected by the free press from this pre-invasion planning, but we can be pretty confident that Russian intelligence can read the White House webpage, even if US journals can't. Russian intelligence did not have to be informed, I'm quoting again, that prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the United States made no effort to address one of Vladimir Putin's most often stated top security concerns, the possibility of Ukraine's membership into NATO. I'm quoting the State Department spokesman. Little notice here. And so it continued after the invasion. Can go on to give you details. There was a March peace proposal by Zelensky, no public support, quite striking. Well, without going into any further details, because I don't want to take time, Putin's invasion of Ukraine was clearly provoked, while the US invasion of Iraq was clearly unprovoked. That's exactly the opposite of standard commentary and reporting. That's worth some thought. Just one final comment, which bears directly on survival. The major pretext that the United States concocted for invasion of Iraq was that Iraq had violated Security Council Resolution 687, which called on Iraq to end its weapons of mass destruction programs, as in fact it had done. Iraq, therefore, had observed the resolution, as now quietly conceded. Unnoticed, however, is that the United States continues to violate the resolution. Crucial fact, the resolution calls on all parties to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. That would put an end to the alleged concerns about Iranian nuclear weapons and the very serious threats posed by failure to deal with the issue, often called here the gravest threat to world peace. Well, it should be quite easy to solve the problem. Nuclear weapons-free zone is strongly supported by Iran, by the Arab states, G77, that's the global south, most of the world. Europe doesn't raise any objections. It's blocked by the United States, most recently Obama. And there's a simple reason: it would require inspection of Israel's nuclear weapons arsenal. The United States, in fact, refuses to acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons, though it's not even a secret. Well, there's a reason. If the US acknowledges it, it would invoke US law, which arguably bans all aid to Israel. So with bipartisan agreement and total silence in media and journals, the US thus chooses to violate the Security Council resolution that it appealed to in invading Iraq. And the US insists upon inciting very serious threats of war, all so as to protect its vast and unprecedented aid flow to the world's last apartheid state. These are more topics that can't be discussed in a free society and that bear directly on prospects for survival. We might perhaps recall Mark Twain's acid remark that it is by the goodness of God that in our country we have those three unspeakably precious things: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and the prudence never to practice either of them. Well, the fate of humanity depends on our ability to break free of this prudence. Thanks.
Thank you, Noam. So deeply grateful to you for sharing all of that, all of your wisdom and the historical context of this conflict, and the need for for talking and coming to a negotiated settlement, and so much more. Mark Twain and freeing ourselves from this insane prudence that you've mentioned here. So now I'd like to welcome you, Dan, to share your wisdom and insight with us.
Thank you, Cynthia. You know, it's interesting talking to my old friend, Noam, who's had so much influence on my own thinking. Can you hear me all right? Can you hear me all right? Yes? Okay. I reflect on the fact he's 93, I'm 91, which means that we lived through the same history, pretty much the same way. I'm always like to ask people how old they are, just to find out if what experiences they went through in their life. Noam is in a class by himself, I would say, in holding on to knowledge that he hasn't directly been involved with all over the world. I'm led to think of analogies in this that I was directly involved in. And but it's the same period as Noam, so he'll remember what I'm talking about. Since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, Russia has very regrettably reverted, I've known, people who really follow this closely are aware, to a reliance on the integration of nuclear weapons with their own armed forces that is exactly similar to what Eisenhower did in '53 and thereon. It was then called the New Look, or bigger bang for a buck, massive retaliation. The idea being that Eisenhower felt that our pretense, our claim of protecting Europe from Russia depended on our ability to initiate nuclear war. And Eisenhower, by the way, did not really believe in limited nuclear war with Russia. He believed it would inevitably escalate. So he had actually one plan at that time for dealing with any conflict with the Soviet Union, whether it rose over Berlin or even Yugoslavia, or really anywhere. That was for an all-out attack, disarming the Soviet Union and hitting every city in Russia and China. And by the way, amazing as it seems, ever since, really, with very small interludes, the idea that China had to be destroyed along with Russia and us has persisted, astonishing as that may seem. The idea being in the Pentagon, you're not going to have US and Soviet Union disarm each other and destroy each other and leaves China to rule the world. So China has to go also if we're fighting with Russia. And by the way, that arose in 1958 in the Taiwan Straits crisis with China, and will arise again as an issue if we recognize Taiwan and China carries out what they have always since Mao warned us they would do, that for other people to recognize what China regards as a province of China as an independent state will result in China invading Taiwan. And we have been moving toward that recognition steadily, just as we moved in toward what was always defined for us by our experts and our ambassadors as the reddest of red lines in Europe, and that was putting Ukraine in NATO, which we haven't actually formally done, although NATO has, since 2008, always said they will be in NATO, an extremely provocative statement, since George Kennan and others, various ambassadors, have said that will weaken the reformist democratic elements in Russia and strengthen the movement of Russia toward a reactionary, nationalistic, militaristic, reactionary, religious, chauvinistic force at the idea of our treating Ukraine not only as an independent state, which it has been recognized as being for the last 30 years, but as being part of a hostile military alliance. Now, as Noam mentioned, even our Secretary of Defense, William Perry, said that was very enthusiastic about the idea that Noam mentioned of a partnership for peace, in which Russia would not only collaborate with NATO, but would be, for all practical purposes, a member of an alliance with us. And when that was really dumped in favor of expanding NATO, Perry has said in his memoir that he strongly considered resigning, thought he might do it, that this was just a terrible approach. As Kennan said, in other words, we have been doing with respect to Ukraine, especially since George W. Bush said in 2008, Georgia will be a member of Ukraine, and other members like Germany and France said internally, not so fast, not by us, precisely because it would be provocative to Russia. But in the face of those warnings, in other words, we have moved steadily toward putting Ukraine into NATO, and as Noam pointed out, as recently as last September, we announced an enhanced partnership with NATO, with Ukraine, that amounted to its being on the doorstep of going into NATO, though not yet. That would have been the ultimate provocation. There is a difference. And I mentioned Taiwan here because the two things are remarkably similar. Putin, obviously, by the speeches he gave last year, in other words, chooses to regard, or his ideology is, Ukraine is not really independent of Russia, that there's a Russia world here, of which Ukraine is part, a younger brother, really part of Ukraine, and what he sees, really part of Russia. And what he sees is Ukraine is sort of trying to secede under Zelensky and others, Poroshenko and others, trying to secede from this Russian sphere and joining NATO, which actual membership would go beyond the weapons we've been giving for years now to US bases and to the installation even of nuclear weapons, or possible bases such as we have in Poland and Romania of so-called anti-ballistic missile bases that could easily be converted into missile bases threatening Moscow. And Putin always mentions this. I think it clarifies both of these situations to see how similar they actually are. And in both cases, we are choosing to move toward recognition, open recognition of Taiwan. We're already supplying with weapons, which would open us to bases on Taiwan and US forces and weapons on Taiwan that we don't have since 1979. And I think we can assume the Pentagon would like to have those back in the face of the fact that it's not just Xi, it's every Chinese ruler since Mao has said, that's war. We don't allow that province to declare its independence, to secede to that extent. And notice the same in Ukraine. If we actually do move into NATO, if they did move into NATO, instead of forswearing that, as Zelensky is now, as during the war, has shown that he's willing to do, to give up the idea of getting formally into NATO, that would mean US bases and US missiles. And not that that would really change the situation so much, but symbolically, it obviously touches every layer of Russian society to think that it would be like sort of Alaska joining the Warsaw Pact or something. It's not something we could allow. Now, how did all this, why could we be doing this? And let me give a suggestion. As I said, not only Gorbachev, but people like Perry, Secretary of Defense Perry, and others have really warmed to the idea, as Noam put it, of a Europe from Atlantic to the Urals, from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And that didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? For a number of reasons, but one being the choice of the US to press the expansion of NATO rather than just the European Union. Now, why would we prefer that to what Noam has described as a very preferable situation, which very much is in this world? And that is a Europe unified in trading terms, in economic terms, in other terms, from the Atlantic to the Urals, is a region that has no place for NATO, because NATO is an anti-Russian, anti-Soviet alliance to which we send military weapons, not the Russians. The Warsaw Pact got their military, including Ukraine, got their weapons from the Soviet Union. We're now supplying them, as we have been to NATO since the fall, to Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Lockheed had representatives in Warsaw before the Warsaw Pact went down, but as soon as the wall went down, they could foresee what was happening, to sell them F-16s and other things. Now we're getting F-35s over there and so forth, in a way that could not happen if Russia was a partner for peace, who, as Putin and others pointed out, who are these weapons for then? What are they for? And the answer is, there's really no rationale for them. Now, that's an immense amount of money that's involved, but there's also the question of the US role in Europe. If the US is not the protector of Europe, against who? Well, against the Russians. Who else? Against the Soviets. What role do they really have to have, say, be the supreme commander of, in every year, from the beginning of NATO till now, as an American? Strictly speaking, we're not a European power. How is it that we have what amounts to hegemony in Europe? And the answer is a protectorate, a protection racket, you could call it. But we are needed because we supply what? The nuclear threat. And that is not just tactical nuclear, and not mainly, it is strategic nuclear weapons. We're the ones who can provide that. If it's not needed, who needs the US? So a Europe united from the Atlantic to the Urals would be a Europe that could be independent of the US economically in other respects. And that's something no president has wanted, and no one who could be president actually has wanted. So now we come up to the point where I would say the people who were benefited by a Cold War, the establishment, the military-industrial complex, or as Ray McGovern calls it, the military-industrial, congressional, academic, it should be financial, fossil fuel, he doesn't have that, media, I call it FEMAC, think tank. All of these people rely very much on a Cold War. And for a while, it was hard to justify that. Who was NATO against? ISIS? Do you really get Trident submarines against ISIS, finance them, and new ICBMs, the ground-based strategic deterrent. Against terrorists, it was a little shaky there for a while, a threat of possible conversion to a peace economy. Russia is the indispensable enemy for the US. And the idea of a friendship with Russia, and China, which is essential for the global cooperation on climate that will preserve civilization as it exists, essential, has now been split in a way, not only by the Soviet aggression or the Russian aggression, and we'll come back to that, but as Noam says, the US response to it. And the US response is not just a mistake. I'm saying it really serves the interests of a Cold War II, which is very profitable to our entire military, industrial, et cetera, establishment. But on the other hand, has the problem that it dooms the global cooperation that's needed for climate and for reducing the nuclear danger. For example, I have for several years been focused on trying to eliminate our vulnerable ground-based intercontinental ballistic missiles because, as Cynthia knows, because they are the hair trigger to the Doomsday Machine. Doomsday Machine meaning if we carried out our strategic plans, which now exist and have always existed since Eisenhower, they will put so much smoke from burning cities into the stratosphere, or it will not rain out, that will cover the globe and freeze all harvests and starve not everyone, but nearly everyone to death. There will be people, maybe 1% of the population, maybe 10%, according to Alan Roebuck and other environmental scientists, in New Zealand, in the Southern Hemisphere, near Australia, eating mollusks and fish. And 1% is 80 million people. It's a lot. 10%, 800 million people. So it's not extinction, but 7 billion people will have suffered an agonizing death in the course of a year of famine and migration, wars, and preparation for total starvation. So that is a possibility right now when we're talking about possibly moving to the possibilities that are real of moving to a nuclear war in this confrontation. Obviously, there are people in the US who are pressing us, understandably in a way, to defend Ukraine more than we're doing by direct involvement in that. In fact, Zelensky exhibited many admirable characteristics, but as head of Ukraine has understandably called from the beginning for a no-fly zone, for direct involvement, for more weapons, for tanks, for this and that. Understandable, except he's calling for a policy that would probably result in the annihilation of Ukraine. That's a cry of desperation. Fortunately, so far, Biden has resisted that. But is Biden being as prudent as I wish he were? He is being prudent up to a point by having resisted that cry, which is coming out from a lot of people even now, to destroy Soviet anti-aircraft on the ground, other radars on the ground, in order to establish what Zelensky calls as a roof, a ceiling. This would be direct conflict with the Soviet Union. And for his part, Putin has been surprisingly, hardly any comments on this, prudent up to a point. He hasn't yet done what is he's hit bases in Romania or Poland that are supplying Ukraine. But where are we going with this? There's every indication, I'm sorry to say, that not only President Biden and Secretary Blinken and Secretary of Defense Austin have been talking about a very long war. They're talking about aims such as regime change, that's Biden, Putin must go, weakening Russia to the point it can't invade a neighbor. That's a very long process in which Ukrainians are dying every day. And of course, Russians, that's the point of it. Bleed Russia, as they said, as we bled Russia in Afghanistan by supplying mujahideen, Muslim resistors to the Russian invasion. Give Russia its Vietnam, said Brzezinski. our leaders are sounding very much like Brzezinski then in 1989. Give Russia what the Soviet Union got in Afghanistan. Give them its Afghanistan in Ukraine. But in Afghanistan in 10 years, the Russians lost about 15,000 men. They've lost that many in 2 months now, 3 months. The Afghans lost 1 million to 1.5 million. Again, we've been preparing since 2015, when the Russians went into Crimea, and we've been preparing for a guerrilla war. And we're talking about it now indefinitely. That will bleed Russia, that will press them, weaken them, et cetera, et cetera. And by all experience, it means 5 to 10 Ukrainians dying for every Russian. In other words, fighting, bleeding Russia to the last Ukrainian life. That's a vicious policy, unsupportable, and yet getting very little criticism right now. To come back to Noam's proposal, I would say the only way of avoiding either an expanding war with the real possibility risk of leading to Putin's use of nuclear weapons and our response in a nuclear war, and it all going, nuclear winter, or an endless 10-year, 20-year war as in Afghanistan, and also the 10-year war of the Russians in Afghanistan, our 20-year war, and which again it must be avoided. And that can only be by negotiated outcome, which involves concessions, which we haven't been willing to talk about, the Russians haven't been willing to talk about yet, and Zelensky has only hinted at. Finally, Zelensky cannot stay in power, probably, maybe cannot avoid assassination, if he really gives up total autonomy or independence, as Putin says, to the Donbass. There's got to be a concession here if this war is to end, in which, let's say, two sides have disputed vision of who controls the Donbass. And that can last for a long time. To fight over that issue indefinitely will serve our military industrial complex and may be preferable to Putin, to ending it, or even Zelensky. But that is humanly a tragic, a disastrous outcome that
Thank you so much, Dan, for sharing all of your wisdom and for putting the current conflict in a larger geopolitical context of what's going on in Asia right now in Taiwan. And also for mentioning the common security vision that existed, as Noam also referred to, and the need, the additional cost of continuing this war is that it is hindering cooperation on the other existential threat of climate change and the urgent need to be back cooperating on nuclear risk reduction and moving towards elimination of nuclear weapons. So thank you so much for that. And I know that I would love for you and Noam to have a chance to maybe dialogue together for 5 or 10 minutes. So is there anything that you two would like to say to each other in this rare opportunity that we have?
I can forego that if you would like. Go ahead.
We
Noam.
agree too much, so it's hard to have a dialogue.
You agree on too much. And any comments you'd like to make to one another before we go to Richard?
I think, Noam, from past conversations, the two of us really privately agree that the likelihood in this situation of approaching, of really ending it without exploding and without its extending indefinitely, which is what our nation seems to be preparing for, is small. The likelihood is that this will either go on for a long time, or will blow up, or will lead to an era of small nuclear wars before it blows up, by changing the whole status of proliferation and everything else. But in other words, no one, including you and me, can really say with any confidence how this will go, with any certainty, but it doesn't look good. It looks very bad to me. Do you disagree?
I think you're right that no one can say with any confidence, but we can say with considerable confidence what the options are. One option, which in fact has been more than hinted at, even stated by President Zelensky a number of times, again last March, one option is a negotiated settlement, and the terms of that have been pretty well known for years. As President Trump, former President Trump said, they've been diminished because of the invasion, but they're still there in some form. The basic terms of a settlement are neutralization of Ukraine. That is, no infringement on sovereignty. It means a status like Mexico. Mexico can't join a Chinese-based military alliance with military exercises in Mexico with the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese army, placing weapons in Mexico aimed at Washington. That's so outlandish that you can't even discuss it. You know, I mean, it's insane. You know, nobody even think about it. Well, that's the status that Ukraine can have, like Austria during the whole Cold War. That's one thing, neutralization of Ukraine. A second thing has to do with Donbas, as Dan said. And the basic terms for that were also pretty well established at Minsk too. Means some form of autonomy for the Donbas region within a federated Ukraine, something like Switzerland or Belgium. Not perfect, but a lot better than slaughtering each other, okay? So that's, and optimally that should be based on an internationally sponsored referendum within Donbass to determine what the people want. Well, that's a goal. Ukraine, Zelensky has come pretty close. That leaves Crimea. And here, President Zelensky is absolutely correct. What he says is the Crimea issue has to be put off for future discussion, maybe in 15 or 20 years. It's not, can't be dealt with right now. It has to be for future discussion. So those are the basic terms of a negotiated settlement. We can ask two questions. Would Russia agree to them? Would the United States agree to them? Well, we know the answer in the case of the United States. It strongly opposes them. It's not only refused to facilitate negotiations, it's taking step after step to block them. Not just my opinion, the opinion of the major experts on the topic. And you can see it from the record. I reviewed some of it. What about China? What about Russia? Would they agree? Well, there's only one way to find out. That's to try. If you don't try, can't find out. US refuses to try. There aren't going to be any real negotiations if the United States doesn't approve them openly, just as Zelensky back in 2019 could not implement the Minsk agreements against the far-right militias threatening to assassinate him unless the US had given him some backing, which it refused to do because it's been pursuing this policy of integrating Ukraine within the NATO alliance with the goal of finally bringing it in, which says no negotiations. Well, that's one option, a negotiated settlement. The other option is what I call this grotesque experiment. Let's see if we can press Putin, who we're told is a certified madman, a lunatic, and so on. So let's see if we can press him to accept total defeat. No escape hatch, accept total defeat, go back and face war crimes trials for genocide. Well, maybe he will. There's another possibility. He might use the power which everyone knows he has, to devastate Ukraine and to move on to setting the stage for a terminal war. So those who really hate Ukrainians and despise them will support the hideous experiment. Seems pretty obvious. Those who care at all about the fate of Ukrainians and the fate of the world will pursue the other option, try to find a negotiated settlement. The basic terms, again, have been understood. If the US had pursued them instead of trying to undermine them, might well have averted the war in the first place. Now the options are diminished, but they may still exist. So the sensible thing is, let's try, pursue them.
Thanks to both of you for again reminding us of what's at stake and the need for diplomacy and a negotiated settlement to end the bloodshed, killing, and immense human suffering on all sides right now. So with that, Richard, I'd like to invite you to comment on what your old dear friends have said.
Well, let me first say that these two brilliant presentations raised many dimensions of the Ukraine crisis in ways that are very congenial with one another and really represent a consensus which I share and which Noam just summarized very well, I think. Let me just raise a couple of issues that weren't discussed, particularly that bear on the nuclear dangers that are embedded in this crisis. One of them is how one interprets the failure to abide by the so-called Budapest Memorandum of 1994, where the Ukrainians were persuaded to give up their nuclear capabilities, and Russia pledged never to attack Ukraine. That in a sense recalls the Libyan experience somewhat earlier, when in 2009 they were persuaded to give up their nuclear program, and a few years later they suffered the consequences of the NATO war, a regime-changing intervention, and it sort of sends a message that nuclear weapons, not for the superpowers and the geopolitical actors, but for secondary states, are a rather significant deterrent. And will not this Ukrainian experience of having been invaded, putting aside the provocations that led to it, induce other countries to seize the option of having some kind of nuclear deterrent for themselves? A second point, I have a slight nuanced disagreement about how Zelensky is characterized. I think that he suffers from the absence of any real sophistication about international relations, and that he's gradually been either induced or persuaded to accept the US interpretation of how Ukraine should pursue its policies. In other words, the openness to negotiation seems much more muted than it did earlier, and the begging for weapons, heavy weapons, and thinking about winning the Ukrainian war has risen to the surface of his consciousness to a greater extent. And that leads me to the sense that it's helpful to distinguish the geopolitical war between the US and Russia from the ground war. They're interrelated, but in the ground war, as we concede, Russia was the aggressor. In the geopolitical war, the US is clearly the aggressor, and as has been suggested, is not interested in some kind of, doesn't appear to be interested in some kind of accommodation, but rather in demonstrating to the world that it is still, after the Cold War, the unipolar basis of global security. No other countries can have spheres of influence near their borders, and that is also a way of sending China a message that should it pursue its aspirations with regard to Taiwan, it will face a similar response to that which has faced the Russians in Ukraine. So in other words, it's the geopolitical strategic stakes have now, it seems to me, almost, I would say they have come to dominate concerns with the well-being of the Ukrainians and Ukraine, and that the pursuing the strategic stakes, as Dan has, I think, convincingly argued, leads not only to the prolonging of the Ukraine war, but also to the heightening of the Russo-American confrontation, and also has disastrous global spillover effects for the peoples of the world in terms of food prices and energy prices and supplies. It already has caused a lot of suffering outside of Ukraine. In other words, the casualties of prolonging the Ukraine war are not just Ukrainians. And even if a nuclear escalation doesn't occur. The final point I would make is this. A few months ago, when the preoccupation was China, there was a lot of talk, including by the head of the US Strategic Command, Admiral Richard, about the fact that Pentagon war games showed that China would win in a regional war unless the US was willing to either accept, unless the US was unwilling to accept such a strategic defeat. And that unwillingness, he argued, required us to prepare for not the war we would like, but the war we would need to fight if we wanted to prevail. And that meant crossing the nuclear threshold. And that was all said in open sources and elicited very little comment. And it was much more strategically grounded than anything Putin has hinted at, which is another aspect of this double standards that infects the media presentation of these issues and is so detrimental to understanding what is at stake and how to avoid the worst outcomes. So I would say that it's extremely urgent that the image of this common security alternative be revived as influentially as possible. And if you read Putin's speech to his own military council a couple of days before the invasion, February 22nd, I believe, he very clearly indicates a receptivity to an enlarged security notion of the sort that Gorbachev proposed. And he even talks at one point of proposing to Clinton that Russia be invited to join NATO. And that whole tenor of his speech is quite contradictory to the demonization image that Biden has pushed without any sense that he is interested in a diplomatic way of resolving these heightening tensions. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Richard, for those comments and raising the points about the role of the media in shaping public opinion about this war, and also reminding us again of the invitation for common security, which is an existential imperative if we're going to cooperate on the other threats that affect humanity moving forward, and that we have to find our way back there somehow, even in this time where it all seems impossible. I would like now to go to the Q&A, and I have a number of questions that have come in, and I'd like to begin with the first one, which is, the question is, I would like to hear what Noam Chomsky and Daniel Ellsberg have to say about the state of public awareness concerning nuclear policy and the extent to which it makes a difference. And I would add to that question, just if you could speak to the human agency and what people can do to make a difference beyond just policy. But in this situation, what your call would be to people, and whether it's possible to make a difference in your opinion.
Okay, since you mentioned my name first, I'll start. With regard to public opinion, we have some evidence. There have been polls. The polls are terrifying. What they indicate is that over a third of Americans, 35%, think we should enter the war in Ukraine, even if it threatens to lead to a nuclear war. What that says is, let's take a chance on total self-annihilation. Americans just don't understand what a war is. They have no conception of what a nuclear war is. In fact, they don't even know what a war is. We're a very unusual country. We've been around for 250 years. Wars are fought somewhere else, okay? No wars are fought here. I mean, since the last time US territory was attacked, actual US territory, not colonies, was in 1814, War of 1812. That's it. Other than that, we fight wars somewhere else, you know. So Americans just have no conception of what a war is. A war is our soldiers who suffer, which they do. I mean, you see it all. I mean, it's just amazing to watch. Take our use of chemical warfare in Vietnam. I mean, right at this moment, babies are dying. Fetuses are dying in Saigon hospitals from our chemical war. Do we do anything about it? Well, finally, after a long struggle, American veterans were able to get some compensation because they suffered from it too. You know, you soak the whole area of South Vietnam with chemical weapons, yeah, American soldiers are going to suffer. So they have some compensation. What about Vietnamese? I mean, it's not even imaginable. You may recall that when the first George Bush arranged for some degree of accommodation with North Vietnam, he calls it North Vietnam. It's worth reading his speech. He said, "We're a generous people. We don't hold grudges. So we'll be willing to eliminate our harsh sanctions and deal with you if you meet one condition. Make sure you locate all the remains of American pilots who you viciously shot down while they were on a tour to Florida." Or take Jimmy Carter at the left, so-called liberal end. He was asked, should we offer some Vietnam some compensation? He said, no. He said, we have no debt because the destruction was mutual. The destruction was mutual. That's Jimmy Carter at the liberal end. I mean, you can see why the world regards the United States as the greatest threat to peace. No one else even close. Again, Americans are protected from this information because the press won't report it, but you can find it by reading the foreign press. Well, that's the way we look at the world. The idea that and why do 35% of Americans think that, well, nuclear war would be no big deal? That's what they hear. That's what they hear from Congress. People saying, why not have a no-fly zone? Why not use weapons to attack Russian soil? Why offer the Russians any way out? Let's just take a chance and maybe they won't destroy Ukraine. And okay, that's what they hear, not only from Congress, but from their echo chambers in the media. You listen to Fox News, that's what you hear. So what's the big deal? It's the same with global warming. I mean, we are, after all, facing an incredible catastrophe. We're marching towards total destruction. Among Republicans, 20% think it's an urgent problem. Well, that's what they hear. So it's the nature of what we call our free press. Go back to Mark Twain again.
Thank you, Noam, for those very sobering comments. Dan, please. Do you have anything to say you'd like to add? Dan, is there anything you'd like to add to what Noam has said?
Well, I agree with what Noam said, but time is going on here. Why don't you carry on to some other questions if you want Noam to give a very big answer.
Okay. So another question that we have here is, in 1991, Dick Cheney put forth a US defense plan that no rival should be allowed to emerge. Rivals identified EU, Russia, China. It seems Clinton and the military-industrial complex adopted the Cheney idea with NATO expansion. Now it is bipartisan. Any comment that you have about that?
Why don't you?
Go ahead. Okay, I'll take a crack at that. Our so-called defense policy, which has very little to do with, in fact, as Noam has often pointed out, is detrimental to the defense of the United States. I mean, the building up of two doomsday machines, which we provoked, if you like, which we did virtually nothing to prevent in the form of Russia in terms of negotiating an agreement that would stop the Russians from building many ICBMs, thousands of warheads, and others, at the cost of stopping ourselves. We've never been willing to do that. And so we're perfectly willing to see this, as I said, this indispensable enemy acquire a doomsday machine, which rationalized our own. When we talk of madness, whether Putin is mad or not, and might he actually use a nuclear weapon, as I suggested at the beginning, that's like it is the same really as asking whether Eisenhower might have used the nuclear weapon in the Taiwan Straits or elsewhere, or Korea for that matter, where he threatened it. And there's a lot of controversy about that. He could have been bluffing in the massive retaliation threats he made. Some people think he was bluffing all the time. I don't. I think that actually our military had gotten into a state of mind that was kind of an institutional madness, divorced from reality, in which they really did talk about large-scale nuclear wars and whether it would be won or not. And whereas now supposedly we have an agreement with the Russians, since Gorbachev reiterated with Putin now and Biden that nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought, the fact is that both sides have been preparing for a nuclear war unstintingly throughout. They did not say that a nuclear war must not be prepared for, planned for, rehearsed, produced, and threatened and risked. And so both sides, the US and Russia, whereas China has declared a no first use policy, we will not initiate nuclear war, as people have become aware, I think this month, neither Russia nor the US does have such a policy. Actually, Brezhnev did proclaim it during the Cold War in the early 80s for a while, but since he wasn't met at all by the US, eventually they abandoned that. That meant, we ask now whether the public is aware, you asked earlier, of the situation. I would say they're not at all aware of the fact that our NATO alliance has been built from the very beginning on a commitment by the US to initiate nuclear war against what was, since 1949, a nuclear weapon state, in fact, a superpower. That's not just a threat of suicide or homicide or even genocide. It's close to omnicide, the death of not everybody, but nearly everybody, nearly omnicide. That's a threat that both sides have been posing continuously now since at least the mid-60s, when the Soviets got a capability for nuclear winter comparable to ours. But the public, I think, has no awareness of this. For instance, people who want to join NATO, like Sweden or Finland right now for the first time. I hope they have the opportunity to say to Sweden, you're willing to join an alliance that is committed to the initiation of nuclear war? That's crazy. Can it protect you in a given situation? Yes, the threat of blowing the world up can, in fact, be effective in the short run, at the risk of blowing the world up and preparing to do it. So I would say, of course, Sweden should not join an alliance that threatens first use. Right now, a movement for us, a way to reduce the risks of the current situation, for us to say, since actually we're not the ones who are threatening first use at this moment, unusually Russia is. Done it a little before, but it was usually bluffs. This one is not clearly a bluff. Wouldn't this be the time for at last us to say, okay, what the rest of the world has asked us for 70 years or so now, no first use. Yeah, we change our policy. We are not going to initiate nuclear war in this situation or ever. And we're not going to do it for Sweden or the Baltics or Poland or anybody. Now, Poland will raise a cry about that. In the Baltics, they'll say, why shouldn't we get the same protection as West Berlin used to get, threatening to blow the world up if we're attacked? And the answer would be, that was always crazy. That was a threat of an insane action. And it's time for us to stop preparing to carry out such an action. Now, is it likely that Biden will at last do what he said he would do in his campaign? Declare that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attack, not to deter conventional attack? No, he said that in his campaign. in the Foreign Affairs article at the time. He's not doing it, and he's not going to do it because we don't have, by the way, his nuclear posture review public yet. It's gone to Congress, so it hasn't been declassified yet. Let me predict right now, it will not carry out his campaign promise to declare that we will not initiate nuclear war. As he said he couldn't think of any reason why we would ever want to initiate it, as said in the campaign and earlier. He's not going to say that because not only the Republicans, but a lot of Democrats would say, you're inviting an attack on Taiwan and you're giving up our deterrence in NATO in general. And the polls will object to that. An answer to that will keep him from saying it. He's not going to give it up now. But a reason for urging him to do it is to say the US can and must form alliances and a foreign policy that is not based on a readiness and a commitment and a preparedness to cause nuclear winter or to initiate nuclear war or to destroy most humans on Earth. That has never been necessary for us. It's been very profitable and has given us a hegemony in Europe that we would not otherwise have had. But it was always crazy. And the public has gone along with that to a point where now they say, gee, we hope that Putin doesn't start nuclear war, but nobody really points the fact that would be crazy. It would be insane. He may not be insane at all now, but for him to carry out the threat would be insane. But we're treating it as no, it's an option he might do, we might do. That mood has to change. And not just because the Russians are worse than us in general. The attack on Ukraine, which has been warned against and threatened for a long time, we haven't tried to prevent it, is aggression as clearly as our attack on Iraq. And that's as clear as it can get. It's the same as the Soviets going into Afghanistan, which again, we invited, we wanted for a long war, or the same as Hitler going into Poland. Anyway, clear-cut aggression. And in line with what Noam was saying also, when I was younger, going back 20 years younger, 70, real young, when 9/11 came along and the New York Times published pages after page of pictures of people with little anecdotes about how they had died in 9/11, which was in fact the closest to being bombed that the US has ever had. We have had war, we had civil war. Being bombed was 9/11. So I thought, okay, with all these pictures of nice looking people, ordinary looking people with little anecdotes saying, she liked to play the piano, he told funny jokes, little anecdotes about how they were. I thought, now, if we could have pictures like that of people who've been bombed like us, maybe we'd understand then who bombing kills and what this is about. We've never had it. Well, that didn't happen, and I no longer expect it to happen. I could say right now, reading the paper, as we look at what's happening to Mariupol and to Kharkiv and to Bucha and the others, I would like, if I were 20 years younger, I might like to say, think, now we see what we've been doing in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and Somalia, and Yemen we're supporting right now, what has been called genocide. So maybe we'd understand that we have to be part of a change in concern about other people, about strangers, about them, that humans haven't shown. Generally, in this nuclear era, in the climate era, we have to transcend our us against them attitudes as humans, which in this world, meaning they and us may all go together. But I have no confidence that's going to happen now. The them is so clearly defined now, and us, that especially as we look at victims who are white Christian Europeans as opposed to brown Muslims, that concern doesn't appear to be generally. But we can do what we can. to move in that direction. That'll take a lot of education of the American public.
I'll just add one word to that. The first question asked, which I didn't answer, asked, what can we do? It's the right question. There's a little bit of history that's instructive. In the early 1980s, there was a major problem of the threat of nuclear war. Short-range missiles were being installed in Europe, Pershing missiles, which could hit 5 to 10 minute flight time to Moscow. Russians were doing the same. A terrible threat of war. Something happened in the United States and Europe. Mass popular protests, the biggest protests in American history, huge, and the same in Europe, huge protests demanding that this lunacy be stopped. Some of you are old enough to remember, it was incredible scale of protests. It worked. It led to Reagan and Gorbachev reaching the INF Treaty. No short-range missiles, in which certainly greatly increased the chance of survival. And it lasted until August 2019, I guess it was, when Trump dismantled the treaty. And to make clear that he meant it, right away, within days, the US launched missiles violating the treaty, showing the Russians, look, we really mean it. Why don't you guys go and build some missiles to attack us so we can go on? It was not the first step. Incidentally, there's a tremendous threat to Russia, not to the United States, to Europe, but to Russia, putting back short-range missiles. George W. Bush, the second Bush, had already dismantled the ABM treaty, which had been laboriously constructed and also considerably reduced the threat of war. US, I won't go through the details, Dan can describe it much better than I can, but this has increased severely the threat to Russia. Trump also was getting rid of the Open Skies Treaty, which goes back to Eisenhower. In fact, the Republican Party in this century has been dedicated to destroying the arms control regime that had been laboriously constructed by Eisenhower, Kennedy, Reagan, slowly put in place over the years. Let's dismantle it. In fact, Trump came very close to destroying the last piece of it, the New START Treaty, which puts a limit on Russian-American weapons. Biden, if the January 6th coup had succeeded, and it was a coup attempt, we would have gotten rid of that too. Biden was able to save it literally within hours. It was due to expire on February 5th, extended it. Well, but that's a lesson. If people do what they did in the early 80s, we can overcome this. There is agency in the hands of the population if they exercise it, not if we just look.
Thank you, Noam and Dan, especially Noam, your reference to human agency at this time, because there have been many questions in the chat about what people can do who are part of the peace movement, where they can go. World Beyond War posted a link. Others have posted reference to a big protest day on May 7th that people can join. And I think I just want to invite you to share brief closing words. And there have been a number of questions that I'm going to kind of mix together here. But they relate to building a global movement that addresses both climate and the nuclear weapons issue. And is there a way to build a global movement to bring these issues together, maybe addressing the intersectionality between the climate crisis and nuclear weapons? So it asking, would putting US military ecological current and potential footprint help global leaders wake up in time? So for collaboration to put evidence, force transparency on the cost of allowing current direction, including genocide of indigenous peoples and nuclear waste, health impacts and existential risks. That's a lot, but maybe you have some closing statements. I think it's really good to leave people with specific ideas about what they might be able to do, a call to action in this time for those who are interested in carrying this work forward. So just short closing words from each of you, and then we'll close together, and from Richard. Thank you.
Okay, I have two thoughts occur to me as I've raised this. When we look ahead, we're looking now at a possible situation in Taiwan, which is almost exactly equivalent to this one. We've raised the same issues of nuclear war. As Noam said, war games have shown that conventionally, we can no longer win a war on Taiwan, 100 miles off mainland China, as we could have done probably conventionally 50 years ago, even 20 years ago. We can't do it without nuclear weapons, and we can't do it with nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons are, now this will blow the world up pretty much. So there's no alternative on that. So the thing I would suggest is then, something that does not exist then, but a public awareness. We must stop moving toward recognizing Taiwan as an independent state, which China never fails to say is their red line, which will lead to this terrible war, just like with the same risks as Ukraine. And to be very specific, Nancy Pelosi was scheduled to go to Taiwan in April and didn't because she got COVID. She's scheduled to go in the fall now. That's like recognizing Taiwan very close to, and China was saying in April, that's moving toward war. No, we should not move toward changing this situation, the one China policy, and encouraging Taiwan to declare independence. And by the same token, we should not be encouraging talk of winning a war in Ukraine any one way, because that does put Putin in a situation that no US or Russian leader has faced actually in the last 70 years. And that is, can he really was he really willing to lose a war if we were preparing to win it without using nuclear weapons? Lose it to a superpower. We have actually been willing, both sides have been willing to lose to small countries which didn't affect our overall credibility. Korea stalemate, Vietnam, we eventually left. Soviets left Afghanistan. We left Afghanistan eventually without using nuclear weapons. That was something I think people didn't expect 70 years ago, that a nuclear power would allow itself to be stalemated or defeated without using its nuclear weapons. But what hasn't happened is losing to another superpower, accepting a lower status in the world than you had before. That hasn't been tested, and it's being tested right now. We cannot afford to win that war in some victorious sense. And Russia, I'm afraid, as a human Putin, whether he's met or not, cannot be counted on to lose that war without using his nuclear weapons. So a concessions on both sides in negotiation that both may be rejecting now will come about only if the public is pressing, I think, for us to change our willingness to get the war over, rather than either an endless war that, quote, bleeds Russia at the cost of Ukrainian lives, or an expanded war which makes everyone else in the world hostage.
Well, just to add a word to that, I agree with all of it. The first thing we have to do, the thing that all of us can do wherever we are, is work to break the incredible censorship in the United States, which prevents anything rational from being discussed. I gave a couple of examples. but if you look through it, it's just shocking. It's a free, open society, incredible censorship. Break it. Start getting people to understand the truth about the world, like what Dan was just saying about nuclear war. Why you just can't have it. Get them to understand that if you want to solve the Ukraine problem without killing everybody in Ukraine, work for negotiations. Don't undertake this hideous experiment that we are now committed to, which is shocking. If there ever is any history, there may not be. People who look back on this won't be able to believe how cruel and savage the mainstream is, saying, let's carry out an experiment to see if maybe Putin will just go away in quiet defeat. But if not, he'll kill a lot of Ukrainians, maybe all of us, but who cares? That's policy. What's more, it's not just now, it's been going on for years. Let people understand that. Same with the climate crisis. Human species is now carrying out a grim experiment. Which way can we destroy ourselves first? Should we destroy ourselves with nuclear weapons, or should we destroy ourselves by wrecking the environment that sustains life? That's the experiment we're carrying out. Our leadership is carrying out. Well, what can you do about it? Educate, organize, demonstrate, act, all the things that have always worked. You just take a look at our country. It's a much more civilized society than it was, say, 50 years ago. The kinds of things that people were saying then, you just couldn't believe today. How did it change? Well, a lot of activism, mostly young people, others have created an understanding that there are people who have rights beyond white Christian males. There are other people who have rights. You go back 50 years, that wasn't understood, literally. You go back 50 years, you can hardly believe what it was like. I mean, Dan and Dick are old enough to remember, but you may remember in 1965, the president of SDS, you know, the main youth activist group, Pol Potter, gave a speech, presidential address. He said, it's come, we have to be courageous, we have to name the system, meaning produce the words capitalism and imperialism. And he gave a speech about this, but he couldn't get himself to pronounce the words. That was too radical and outrageous. It was almost like saying that women are people, not property, as they have been under US law since the founders changed in 1975. Couldn't say those things. He couldn't pronounce the words capitalism and imperialism. Well, it's changed. We had anti-miscegenation laws in the 50s, in the 60s, that were so grotesque that the Nazis refused to accept them. But we had them. Well, been a lot of changes. Country has gotten a lot more civilized, not by magic, by people using the agency that they have, just as the INF Treaty was brought about by people acting. It's no different now. You don't have to sit passively and quietly while we march to Armageddon. Not necessary.
Are we over time, Cynthia? Or could
Well, if you have just a short, if you have like 1 minute or something, if you want to add something, and then I'm going to go to Richard and we'll close. But please, if there's something you want to say.
Okay, well, first, I can't resist saying I was present when Pol Potter said that on April 17th, 1965. It was my first date with Patricia Marx, whom I've been married to now for 52 years. And so first, I heard that speech by Paul Putter, and I then volunteered to go to Vietnam after I was there for 2 years. So people can change, and I offer myself as an example. And they change by the hearing people like you, no, not just like you. There's nobody like you, truthfully, but hearing Noam and hearing Dick Falk very specifically and others. Okay, I'm going to say something that I think Noam agrees with, but I won't speak for him. This will drive some of our listeners crazy when I said this, but when you say, what can we do right now to affect the terrible prospects that are facing us now of a divided world, unable to collaborate either on reducing nuclear danger or climate, and that is that I agree with every criticism the left or anybody has ever made of the Democratic Party. They are as bad as anyone says. And if Republicans take Congress in November and thus by that take over the presidency in 2024, the foreign policy may or may not change. That's terrible. But on climate, we will, on the Titanic, have hit the iceberg. Unless we prevent the Republicans on the matter of climate from taking over our government, and we can do that by a lot of effort between now and November this year, and for the next 2 years, it's up to us when it comes to agency. If we don't, then the Titanic has hit the iceberg. We're going to go down. So there is a bit of agency that a lot of people will ruffle the hackles of a lot of people listening to us because they're so aware of how bad the Democrats are, and they are, but not to acknowledge that the Republicans are worse on climate is a delusional state, not unlike believing in QAnon.
Powerful words, Dan. Powerful words. Richard, please, just if you'd like to, please.
Just a couple of points. I mean, there's so much to say and left saying. Let me just say that the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, which sponsored this event, really does try to come to terms with the connections between the nuclearist agenda and the climate change agenda, and indeed envisioning a world of peace and justice. And I encourage all those who are concerned with these issues to join us in this effort. And I think one thing that hasn't been said that is a matter of historical perspective is that if one returns to the famous farewell address of George Washington, which preached against entangling alliances, there might be a lot to learn that's relevant to the present reality. Because the US was so intimidated by its own reluctance to enter World War II, it's gone to the other extreme after World War II. And now not only is it promiscuously belligerent, but there is no war, no conflict anywhere on the planet that isn't of prime concern to Washington. And that's partly for the military-industrial complex's continuing affluence, and it's partly this geopolitical hubris that has overwhelmed our sense of prudence and care for the planet and for ourselves and for others. Let me stop.
Thank you, Richard, for those inspiring words. And really, it's been a privilege to witness this conversation with you, Dan and Noam, and Richard, with your comments at this very dangerous moment for humanity. Thank you for reminding us of the stakes, that our lives are at stake and the future of humanity is at stake. And let this be a wake-up call. And just on the note of human agency, Dan, you're talking about our need to get the Democrats back in the Congress in the fall, that we have to do that. And Noam, educate, organize, demonstrate, and act, and reminding us of what we did in the 1980s. And if we did it then, you've both issued a clarion call to action, along with you, Richard, for peace and justice. If we did it then, we can do it again now. We need to do all of those things, and that change is possible. Your own transformation, Dan, from a nuclear war planner to a whistleblower activist that you've reminded us of. We can do this, and we must. So thank you all again for coming. And I want to let you know that our next program in the series will feature a conversation between Richard Falk and California Governor Jerry Brown on May 26th. We'll be sending the registration information out next week, and we hope to see you all next month. Thank you to all of you who have been joining us from around the world. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Be well and be safe, and may peace prevail.